Hello, and welcome to the Tennessee Principal Professional Learning Series. My name is Jim McIntyre, and I serve as the Director of the Center for Educational Leadership at the University of Tennessee. And during the current public health crisis, the University of Tennessee has developed this program of 7 professional learning modules to provide research, information, and a chance for professional dialogue around several of the key leadership challenges principals in the volunteer state are facing right now. Today's session is on strategic resource planning, and it includes 2 recorded video presentations that will examine how to organize school resources, including people, time, and money, to support high-quality instruction and personalized learning for our students. You'll have an opportunity to explore several potential school resource models developed by the organization Education Resource Strategies, and you'll also have a chance for some small group discussion among your peers today. As we dig into the topic of school resources amidst the current national dialogue on racism, discrimination, and disparity, I invite you to really consider and reflect upon how strategic choices in the use of funding, time, and personnel might be utilized as levers to address disparities, enhance equity, and close achievement gaps in our schools, particularly during this moment of crisis. You can access all of the resources for this session on our website at the Center for Educational Leadership, and the web address is shown on the current slide. You'll also see all of the modules that we've worked through in the Principal Professional Learning Series, and that we're currently on module number 6, which is focused on strategic resource planning. We hope you'll join us next week for module 7, which talks about school culture, collaboration, and community. Toward the end of the session, I will put a link in the chat box for a survey that will ask you to please fill out when you get a moment. It'll only take a minute or 2, and it really gives us great feedback. We want to make sure that this is an excellent learning opportunity for you, so we really take that feedback very seriously. That survey will also allow the Tennessee Department of Education to be able to know when to apply your TASL credit, either to this year or to next year. Well, before we begin, I want to express our appreciation to Commissioner Schwinn and the Tennessee Department of Education for making this opportunity available to public school principals in Tennessee. I want to thank the University of Tennessee in Knoxville and the College of Education, Health, and Human Sciences for their support and also making this opportunity available to you. And I also want to recognize the contributions of our content experts and the support of our philanthropic partners, including Education Resource Strategies, the American Institutes for Research, and Tennessee SCORE. We're delighted to have David Rosenberg from Education Resource Strategies as our expert presenter today on strategic resource planning. We'll begin with a video presentation that will introduce the key dynamics and trade-offs in effective use of resources to support student learning and success. I wanted to give you just a sense of what the arc of the conversation looks like today. And so we'll start with the video, as I mentioned, with David Rosenberg from ERS. We'll have some time for individual reflection on some of the questions that he raises. We'll talk in small groups about some key questions that I'll post in the chat box in just a moment, so you can be thinking about them as you watch the video. We'll go back to David Rosenberg and ERS for a few minutes of video where he'll begin to talk about some potential school models. What could schooling look like in the fall with all of the challenges and constraints that we face, and what kind of trade-offs might we have to make in order to put those models in place. And then you'll have a chance to spend some time in independent research and exploration of some of those school comeback models, as they call them, at ARS. We'll see the rest of the video from David Rosenberg to talk about in detail a couple of those school comeback models, and then we'll end with some small group discussion and wrap up. So we got a lot to do today in the 90 minutes that we've got, and so we'll go straight to the video presentation from David Rosenberg at Education Resource Strategies to start.
Hi, and welcome to the ERS portion of our presentation for Module 6 on resource planning of the Principal Professional Learning Series. My name is David Rosenberg. I'm a partner at Education Resource Strategies, and I'm pleased to join you virtually for the conversation today. We've establishing 3 goals for our time together. By the end of this module, we are hoping that all participants will understand why strategic resource use matters and how strategic schools organize resources to ensure their students achieve excellence with equity. Secondly, we want to identify some of the trade-offs that leaders face in designing comeback models that work for their communities. And third, we are going to ensure you have access to tools and resources that help you plan for a return to school, even in the face of uncertainty associated with the current pandemic. So we're going to have this discussion in two parts. The first part is going to cover the first three bullets that are here. I'll tell you a little bit about ERS, and we'll talk about this question of how much we spend versus how well we use resources, and give some examples of how strategic schools organize resources. We'll send you off then for discussion and reflection with your team. And then we'll come back and focus on recovery and school reentry in the pandemic, and specifically decision points that leaders face and options that are on the table for returning to school, the trade-offs associated with those. So first, briefly, a little bit about ERS. We are a nonprofit organization. We work all over the country. And our focus is on helping district, state, and school leaders transform how they use resources so that every school can prepare every child for tomorrow, no matter that child's race or income. A quick note on resources. Sometimes when we say resources, people immediately think budget, they think bean counting, they think that's not what I do. The reality is in school districts in particular, resources encompasses people, time, and money. And the reality is that 80% or so of the resources that we have in school districts, we invest in people. And one of the most valuable commodities those people have is the time that they have and how we organize that time. So when we talk resources, we talk people, time, and money, we're actually talking about the core of how we do school and how we organize systems to support education for all students. At ERS, we're very fortunate. We get to work with leaders in states and districts across the country. We've had the pleasure to work and the privilege to work in the state of Tennessee over the years, most recently in Nashville and Memphis. Through our district and state work, we create tools and research that we then publish out to the field that document how real districts and real schools are transforming. That comes in the form of online tools, of papers, videos, and assorted resources, some of which we'll talk about as we get through our session today. So let's talk about this question of resources and this idea of how much we spend versus how well we've got. So on the how much front, we can think about how much we spend as a country overall on K-12 education. And this graph is showing us two sets of data. The blue line is showing us the total billions of dollars that we spend in the country annually to educate kids in kindergarten through 12th grade. And the green line is showing us what is that as a percentage of our overall economy or GDP. And what you can see is that for most of the post-war era, education funding in the United States grew at 8 to 10% a year. That started to slow a bit about 30 years ago. And of course, we've seen a dip most recently, or a slowdown in growth, I should say, over the last several years when Race to the Top expired. And a slight dip in terms of what that represents as a percentage of GDP. But we can also recognize the proportion of our economy that goes to educating kids remains at about 3.5%. And with the exception of the Race to the Top period in the Obama administration, that's been pretty consistent for the last 50 years or so. So we invest significantly to educate our kids. Always the question of should we or could we invest more, but we know that there's real money on the table here. We also know that how much districts spend to educate kids, which is a function of several factors that we'll look at in a second, really varies quite widely. Each of these blue bars are districts that ERS has worked with over the last several years, and you can see the variation in dollar per pupil spending in these districts varies quite widely. There's a 300% variation in what we see. And we also know that where the money comes from can vary quite widely. So the left-hand bar here shows us that nearly half of dollars on average in school districts around the country come from state revenues. About 8% comes from the federal government and another 45% from different forms of local revenue. But what we can also see is that in our highest poverty districts, particularly all except the few largest ones, are more reliant on state revenue. And also all of our higher poverty districts are more reliant on the federal government. So at a time when we're already seeing state revenues decline due to the current economic situation, we may see a cascade into local taxes and increased reliance on the federal government. Some of our highest need districts are at the greatest risk in terms of where their revenue is coming from. But back to this question of comparing to how well, in theory, you would think, well, gosh, if we need to spend more, we should be getting higher outcomes for kids. And what this graph shows us is that that's just not the case, as we see around the country on average. And so each of the dots you see here represent a state. We've got Tennessee in green down here. And our x-axis is the average dollar per pupil in that state. Y-axis is NAEP results, in this case, grade 8, but you could apply any academic metric to this. And what you see here, if you're inclined to statistics, you see an R-squared of nearly 0 and a trend line that is basically flat, which tells us there isn't a relationship. If you're not a statistics guru, you can look at this and just say, well, that looks like buckshot. There's no relationship here. And so this is the burning question that we face and researchers face, is why do we consistently find such a consistently negligible relationship between how much we spend and student learning outcomes? I think this boils down to a few factors. The first one is that dollars are invested in things that just don't improve student performance. The research tells us that reducing class size across the board by 1 or 2 students doesn't, at scale, affect student learning, as one example. Paying teachers in ways that are fully about longevity and degrees earned and not related to contribution or impact does not line up. Or overly restrictive settings for special education that pull kids into substantially separate environments where learning isn't happening in the same ways at the same rate that we think it needs and could be happening for those students. It's a high cost, low value, low impact investment. We also know dollars per pupil is a very broad metric. Doesn't actually, it's not actually rooted in what helps students learn. A lot of which goes to the issues around differentiation that you all worked with in your last session. And then we also know dollars per pupil is aggregated at the school or program level, so it doesn't actually touch on what students experience over the course of a day. It's not particularly representative. So we do know that some schools and some systems succeed with the dollars that they have for their students. And so the question is, how do those schools organize resources differently? We have to recognize the context that we're in. Systems face what we call a triple squeeze that complicates transformation efforts, although we don't believe it has to stop them. And that triple squeeze involves a higher bar for student learning and increased student need, which is only being exacerbated right now, as we'll talk about in our second part of the conversation. We have unsustainable cost structures in many cases, and we have revenue that is flat or declining, or certainly not increasing at the rate of need and growth in many districts. So, systems and schools that achieve excellence with equity make it possible for all students to succeed. They make deliberate choices about how they use resources in ways that fundamentally shape the experience of students and teachers. And we're going to look at a couple examples of that now. So we went and read the research, looked at high-performing systems all over the country and academic research around them, and tried to sort of boil it down to some common strategies and practices. And in this case, we're going to boil it down to 4 categories. The first set of strategies around getting the right people into schools and roles. And that includes things like how we hire, how we compensate teachers, what our career paths look like, what kind of support we provide. The second piece is really all about professional learning and what we call connected professional learning looks like. Third, differentiating time and attention, which you delved into with instruction partners over the last couple of sessions. And leveraging the full community, which is more important now than ever as we think about understanding community need and preference and how school works, and also in leveraging the full set of resources available in the community, thinking really broadly about what school is and how we expand the definition of ways in which we can use resources to support students. So a couple of quick examples to go through on these. The first one on getting the right people into the right roles, teacher leadership becomes really crucial here. And in this moment, we think it's essential. Now, some of the roles you could imagine for teacher leaders look similar to what we've had before. We have grade level leads or department leads. And ideally, these are people who are really deeply knowledgeable about content. These are not administrative roles. They are focused on analyzing student work. They can lead a team. They are deep into their expertise on instruction. Family community liaison is another example of a role that exists today, but there are also some roles that are new that we could think about now. And these are just a smattering of examples. As we think about remote learning, we now have a need for remote learning leaders who can really figure out how we work in a remote environment and create the lessons that are super engaging for kids, and how you actually run remote instruction, whether that's synchronous or asynchronous. There are care teams that we think we need to be pulling together to provide the direct social emotional support that kids require embedded in instruction and in their classes, but also creating the time we need to ensure kids have what they need. And then you could imagine a whole set of other remote roles for teachers and facilitators, coaches, and so on. The second piece I want to highlight here is connected professional learning. And so we all know what traditional PD looks like, and we know what bad PD looks like, but it's very rare to find great PD, or what we call professional learning, in a connected context. And from our study published in Igniting the Learning Engine of 4 systems that were having success and attributed to their professional learning strategy, we saw a few things happening. One, each one had really rigorous and comprehensive curricula that were aligned to assessments. They had meaningful, significant investments in collaboration that was content-focused and led by experts in the curriculum being taught. And they had processes for frequent growth-oriented feedback, way more than the annual or semi-annual flybys that many teachers experience. And what really marked the difference between these districts and others is that this was all connected together. So to compare this to what traditional PD looks like, in a traditional context, you may have a not particularly engaging or rigorous curriculum that may or may not be aligned to assessments, or may not be lesson plans. So teachers are sort of on their own to do their planning. Their teams are fairly administrative in nature, or the work is disjointed from what's happening in classrooms, and then they get that annual flyby or a visit from a coach every once in a while to try to help them. In connected professional learning, you've got a really robust, high-quality curriculum. It is linked to lesson plans and assessments that teachers can adapt for the needs in their schools and for their students. You've got big investments, typically as much as 90 minutes per week of collaborative time led by instructional experts focused on content. And then the learning that is happening in that collaborative time is not only deployed in the classroom, but it forms the foundation for the observations and the feedback that's happening, grounded in the instruction and the content being taught, and the observation and the feedback is being provided by somebody who is deeply familiar with that content. Last piece I want to talk about here as an example is differentiating time and attention. This is data from a set of schools in Tennessee. These are middle schools. And in this particular system, there was an explicit decision to focus on literacy instruction in middle school to ensure that all middle school students reach high school ready to engage in higher order learning that was embodied by the aspirations in the curriculum at the high school level. And there was a belief that we needed to start this in 6th grade, because not all students were coming out of elementary school with the skills that they needed. So when we looked at actual resource use, what we found is, what we often find is that the practices didn't align with the strategy. So here you see class sizes for ELA classes in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and all non-core classes. And you can see they're about the same across the board. And the question we asked is, if you didn't have a dime more, if you had the same volume of resources, what could you do to try to embody the strategy that you've outlined in terms of supporting literacy in middle school, particularly ELA instruction starting in 6th grade? So one option we saw was, well, we could make a trade-off. We could reduce class sizes in ELA, and in return, we increase class size in our non-core classes. So that would be a clearer differentiation of resource use along with our strategies. We could go further. We could say, actually, we need to focus this in 6th grade. And so let's put all of those resources that we were putting towards reducing class size to reducing 6th grade class size. And now I can get classes in 6th grade that are down to an average of 16. And then when I think about any additional resources I can deploy, whether it's an interventionist, a coach, or anybody else that we can bring into that, you could really start getting some serious small group instruction happening. And so class size is only one metric, and it's not the be-all end-all, but is one way of saying, look, the decisions we make, and we make them implicitly or explicitly, but the decisions we make about how we organize the people, time, and money in our school can have a meaningful impact on the student experience and aligning them up with our strategy and our goals. So, in summary for this section, school systems and schools that are moving closer to realizing excellence with equity get the right people into the right schools and roles. They support and organize to support connected professional learning. They differentiate learning time and attention based on the needs of students, and they think about the full community as part of the schooling community. And doing this means really thinking critically about how you allocate people, time, and money, what investments support your strategies. Think about equity. To dollars and resources follow where students need them. You have to make hard trade-offs, right? Nobody wants to see that non-core class grow to 28 kids in the last example we looked at, but it's a trade-off that might make sense since what we said we needed to do as a school and a system is really invest in middle school literacy. And then the last piece is related to that, which is what we're doing today strategic and intentional? If it's not strategic and intentional, then what different decisions could we make to better support our students? So I'd like to lead you into your next, your first round of discussion for this session, and really focusing it on the categories and strategies that we just talked about. And I'd love for folks to reflect with their teams and colleagues on two questions. One, which of these do you see as a source of strength in your school? And which do you think offer the greatest opportunity for improvement? So I'm going to leave you to your conversations. Look forward to reconvening in a little bit, and we will start focusing on the current moment and some of the decisions that leaders face in mapping out reentry this fall.
Okay, very good. So our thanks to David Rosenberg at Education Resource Strategies for sharing that presentation with us. We'll get back to with David in a few minutes for the second half of his presentation. But in the meantime, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to do just a quick individual reflection on the questions that David posed around the common strategies that the research has found are utilized by high-performing schools and school systems. And so you'll have about 3 minutes just to think about these strategies and then answer the questions that really think about and answer the questions for yourself that David asked. Which of these strategies is a source of strength in your school? Which offers the greatest opportunity for improvement? And after you've got a few minutes to reflect on that, we're going to go to small group conversation. And just so you know what that will look like, here are the questions that we'll ask there. Again, first two are the questions David asked. Well, first is, was there anything that surprised you about the common strategies for high-performing schools and systems? Was there anything in there that you didn't expect to see? And then the two questions David asked, and then are any of these strategies that are utilized by high-performing schools and school systems going to be particularly important as we return to school in the fall in the pandemic era? And then I do like the phraseology that ERS uses, which is that we can do anything we want, we just can't do everything we want. So what choices and trade-offs might you be willing to consider in order to embrace some of these really important strategies that are utilized by high-performing schools in terms of which strategies your school might need most? So what are the trade-offs you might be willing to consider? But first, we're going to do about 3 minutes of quiet individual reflection on where you are in your school with regard to these strategies. So I'll give you 3 minutes from right now. Okay, we'll move to small group conversation, and the way this will work is I will click the button to open the breakout rooms. You'll get an invitation. When you accept that, it will bring you to the small group conversation. We'll have facilitators in the small group to pose these questions and keep the conversation moving forward. You can also have access to all of these slides and to David Rosenberg's slides from our website at the Center for Educational Leadership, and I put that in the chat box recently as well. So I'll open all of our small group discussion rooms right now. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back from small group, and hope you had a good, productive conversation. And we're going to dive back into the second presentation by David Rosenberg at Educational Resource Strategies. And then about midway through this presentation, we'll have an opportunity to do some independent research and exploration of what ERS is calling school comeback models. So what are some possible configurations of resources, of time, of people, of money that you might consider for the fall, and what are the trade-offs associated with that? So we'll have some opportunity to hear about a few of those models, to do some independent research and exploration, and then David will actually dig into a couple of those models more deeply in the video, and then we'll have some opportunity for small group conversation as well. So we'll go back to David Rosenberg from Educational Resource Strategies right now.
Welcome back. Hope you had a nice discussion with your team. We are going to shift gears and focus on decision points and options for returning to school in the context of the current pandemic and addressing the needs of our students in this important time. So we discussed earlier that before the pandemic, systems faced this triple squeeze that complicated transformation efforts. We had a higher bar for student learning, significant needs, all of which have been exacerbated both by pandemic-related issues and by the economic and social context in which we're living today. We have unsustainable cost structures, and we have flat or declining revenue in many places. And all of that is made more complex by new student need that is emerging due to learning loss over the last several months. We have new physical distancing requirements, and we have new financial pressure due to likely revenue declines, many of which are already hitting state and local coffers. So to respond to these greater student needs, we need to be investing in several important areas. We've got to be assessing student learning, social emotional needs. We've got to do the differentiation and new time and attention programming that are required and that you've been discussing in prior sessions. And we need to think about social emotional support for students as well as for educators. And we recognize we also have imperatives around physical distancing that will complicate the ways in which we come back to school. So over the last 6 to 8 weeks at ERS, we've been working on really trying to learn as much as we can about what options are in front of us and developing some tools and resources to help school and system leaders design solutions that are right for them and for their students. And so we're going to touch on several of the tools and resources here, and then point you to them for when we wrap up this work, so you'll be able to access everything that's here. We're going to take a pretty quick spin through, and so it'll be important that you have access to all of this when we wrap the session. So most districts and schools are considering an array of comeback models for the fall, and broadly speaking, these fall into 3 categories. There's in-person, which is what we know best. Students attend school in a school building every day. There's the idea of a hybrid model, where students attend school both in person and remotely, and they do so based on an established, predictable schedule. And then there's remote school, which is what we experienced in the spring, where students attend school from home or some other location. They use their laptops and the internet to engage in instruction, which might be synchronous with an educator or asynchronous, where it's done independently. In any scenario, we know we have a complex set of factors to work through. We are addressing the needs, academic and social emotional needs that we've described. We need to provide support and prepare teachers for multiple contexts. We need to think about technology, about equity, about the types of programming and staff that we need. There's just a lot of factors that come into play, no matter what scenario we're planning for. Quickly, I just want to align our language to what the Tennessee Department of Education has provided through their guidance. So TNDOE provided 4 categories for return to school. Their category 1 is in person. There's multiple options included there, but all of them we would consider in-person instruction with students physically in school buildings. Option 2 is all remote, students participating in virtual and distance learning. And then the models 3 and 4 are basically all hybrid models in some form, and there's different pieces of that, different variants of that we'll discuss. So to that point, hybrid can mean a lot of different things. And it was one of the biggest areas of learning for us as we uh, unpacked what it looks like. And some of the ways in which hybrid models can vary are thinking about schedules. So are students coming every other day, every other week, or their 2-day cycles, where they're in and out of school during a week? What does student grouping look like? And we'll talk a little bit about this idea of a homeroom where students work in a cohort, or a split schedule where students might work in a cohort, but their days look different depending on if they're in school or not. And then there's the role of the teacher, who may need to be teaching in person, may need to be teaching remotely, may need to be doing both, and may even be asked to do both simultaneously. But what all of these factors have in common, and all hybrid models have in common, is a belief that it is better for at least some students to be in person some of the time than for any student who wants to be in school in person to have to be remote all of the time. Now, as with any set of decisions, there are resource trade-offs involved. And so it is entirely possible that you and your system might determine that the trade-offs aren't worth realizing that belief. But that's the basic grounding of a hybrid model, is that we want kids to be in school, as many kids as much as we can, even if it's not everyone and it's not all the time. So let's delve in briefly into this idea of homeroom versus split. This turns out to be one of the biggest and most interesting decisions about the hybrid modeling work that we've done. And I'd like you to consider for a moment a classroom of 28 kids, and in this case, 12, the purple ones here, are in person and the remainder are working remotely. So in a traditional homeroom structure, those kids would travel together from class to class, or the class to them, as the case may be, regardless of whether they're in person or remote. So the simplest way to do this, in some ways, from a resource standpoint, would be just to have a single educator running that classroom. We're asking that educator to manage in-person and remote students simultaneously, which is a new challenge. So one solution to that might be, well, let's put 2 educators in the classroom. The second one maybe doesn't even need to be certified. And we could potentially increase the group size a bit, but generally speaking, 2 educators with a class of 26 or 28 kids is the kind of thing that we always would have, in many cases, would have loved to do. And often the resource levels create a constraint that make it difficult to do that. And so there's yet this other option of what we call a split schedule, or what you do on your A day and what you do on your B day, your in-person versus your remote day as a student, would vary. You'd have a different schedule. And so you'd be working with different teachers on those days. And potentially, we could group larger groups of kids on the remote day to try to make this a little bit more efficient to operate with the resource constraints that we have. As you can imagine, the experience of the students and the experience of the teachers in each of these 3 options, the 1 educator homeroom, the 2 educator homeroom, or the split, look very different. And so the resource implications are significantly different as well. So as I mentioned, we've developed some comeback models, as we call them, so far. There's 6 on our website. I want to talk about 2 of them, but you'll note here that each one is a different combination of who's in person, who's remote, or where there's a hybrid, where the same students are attending school in person or remotely, depending on the day, along an established and predictable schedule. So I'd like to just draw on Model 1 and Model 3 briefly to make a couple of comparisons.
So I'm going to stop us there for just a moment, because David is going to dig into a couple of the school comeback models, as they call them at Educational Resource Strategies, in just a moment. But before he does, I'd like you to have the opportunity to really look at all of these models, or at least to look at one of them in depth. So Education Resource Strategies has developed these 6 potential models around how to organize resources and to think about time, people, and money in different ways with different scenarios that schools might consider for the fall. And so what we're going to do is take about 10 minutes for you to do some independent research and exploration of these models. So there's 2 different ways to access this information. One is through the Center for Educational Leadership website. And you can go there, and there's a resource exploration document that has the links for these different models. The other way to access this information is go directly to the ERS website. I'm going to copy that link for you into the chat right now, so you can go. Probably the easier way to do it is go directly to the ERS website. And just a note about how this is structured. So you see the matrix here with the 3, there are 4 elementary models and 2 secondary models. And just note that you need to click into that blue box that has the model number on it. If you click into that, there's a really detailed explanation of each of these models. And so you can really dig in. They're very robust, they're very deep, and there's a lot of detail there. And so you can take a look at one or more of these models. And then we'll have some conversation about them after you do that. And just to give you a preview, I've put this in the chat as well, but just to give you a preview of what we'll talk about in the small group after we do this exploration, and then after David digs in deeper to models 1 and 3, we'll talk about which model did you explore and what were some of the advantages and trade-offs of it. I really want to talk about guiding principles. I think this is a really important concept. David will talk about what, the guiding principles that drive your planning in the fall. So for an example, David noted that hybrid models are grounded in the belief that it's better for at least some students to be in person some of the time than any student who wants to attend school in person to be remote all of the time. So, questions like, do you espouse that belief? Is that something that you believe? Or what other beliefs or guiding principles that you hold that will help drive your planning for the fall? And then finally, what are you thinking about in terms of some of the choices that you might adopt for the fall? So we're going to go for about 10 minutes. Before we do that, I did want to just acknowledge and thank Dean Ellen McIntyre, who is here with us today. Dean McIntyre is the Dean of the College of Education, Health, and Human Sciences at the University of Tennessee. We're just delighted to have her joining us today for the Principal Professional Learning Series. So we will go to this independent exploration. We'll have 10 minutes, and I will set my timer here. So go ahead and turn off your video, turn off your microphone, and explore some of these school comeback models. And hopefully you'll have a chance to explore at least one of them in depth. So 10 minutes from right now, and enjoy your exploration. Okay, very good. So we'll start to come back together. And again, I apologize for the compressed time frame. But the good news is these resources are there on Education Resource Strategies website, and you can continue to explore these school comeback models, these resource models at your leisure. And as you see, they're quite in-depth and quite detailed in terms of the way that they approach the challenges that we might face in the fall. So great resources, and I think give some real good insight about potential considerations for how you might structure schooling in the fall. I'm going to go back to our video because David Rosenberg is going to actually highlight a couple of these models and look into the details with us, and then we'll have an opportunity for some small group conversation after we finish the video.
So I'd like to just draw on Model 1 and Model 3 briefly to make a couple of comparisons. Let's start with Model 1. And in Model 1, this is an elementary school model where our kindergarten through 3rd grade students are fully in person and our 4th and 5th graders are fully remote. And we're going to walk through the logic of why it is that that's the trade-off that was made. So in this example school, this is a hypothetical school, it turns out that to get all kids in person with physical distancing that is expected or planned for, in this case, 70% of kids, gen ed and inclusion students, can be in the school building. And so the way we get to that is by considering, well, who are the staff that can be with students in person? And in this school, there's 31 certified staff and 8 teaching assistants who we think can be in charge of a student group at any given time. And then we think about what with physical distancing is the group size that's required for in-person, and we're assuming based on the configuration of the school building and the rules in place in this area, the planning is for 13 kids in a group. And so the question becomes, with 39 instructional staff, how many kids can you support in person with what type of remote staffing, given what you need to do for in-person staffing? And it turns out in this particular case, with a group size of 13 for in-person, if you're willing to go for a 28 students to teacher ratio for remote instruction, you can support just over 70% of kids in the school building, or about 4 out of the 6th grade levels. And in this example, the school leaders have determined we would like to have 70% of our kids in person all the time and develop a remote model for everybody else. So how do they do that? Well, the first thing we think about is staffing required to support in-person versus remote instruction. And so the way we get to small group sizes, if all of our kindergartners, first, second, and third graders are in person, is we staff those grade levels really heavily. So instead of just having the usual 4 homeroom teachers at each grade, we add 4 other staff, TAs, interventionists, librarians, specialist teachers. And that allows us to create these smaller group sizes. The trade-off is that for our remote kids, we have larger group sizes, in this case 25, and we have 1 homeroom teacher who is charged with providing all the specials instruction for all 4th and 5th graders. And there's departmentalization happening here to enable this to go forward effectively. I want to name here also, we've maintained 2 self-contained classrooms for students with disabilities that require a substantially separate setting, each staffed with a teacher and a para, separate from everything else that we have. So this is an example of what the trade-off associated with staffing in person for small group sizes means. You might have to make a trade and have other students working remotely with larger group sizes. Let's now look at elementary model 3. And in this case, the example is one where every student who wants it is in a hybrid model where they come to school about half the time. And in this case, the schedule is split. And that's how this school makes the model work with the constraints on resource levels. So in this case, you've got staffing for students to come in with group sizes of 14 on their in-person day. And to do that, given the size of the school, we have 3 teachers working at each grade level over the course of the day. And then we have our remote days, which are led by different teachers. In this case, one teacher with a core background, interventionist or librarian, and 1 non-core teacher together. And so this is what the group sizes look like for the time that teachers are with their students on any given day. Remember, students are only in school every other day. So the 80 students, 40 who are in school are in group sizes of 13 or 14 with their teachers, and the 40 who are not in school are in group sizes of 40 to 1, at least ratios of 40 to 1 with their pair of other teachers. And again, we have 2 self-contained classrooms reserved. So we can think about what does the day look like for a student on a remote day. And an in-person day, we can imagine what that schedule is like. It may look a lot like what in-person school looks like, but on a remote day, it looks a little bit different. So we mentioned that there's 2 teachers leading most of the instruction. In this case, an art teacher and an interventionist. There's also an ELL teacher assigned to provide support across multiple grades the course of the day. And so the remote day in this case for students are 6 hours long, of which 4.5 hours is directly with educators. And those are the ones shaded in that orange, yellow color. And then of that time, 3.5 hours are core instruction. In this case, we have asked our art teacher to become comfortable and supported to deliver ELA instruction over the course of the day. And our interventionist is focusing on math instruction. And then there's time for English language development as well as independent time. Now, those are 2 individual school examples, but the trade-offs you make could happen across the whole system. And this is what district leaders are focusing on right now, is thinking about, well, what do I want to do at different levels in different schools? And so here's an example of what a system-wide view could look like for these COVID comeback models. In this case, elementary schools all offer hybrid models that are split, like the Model 3 we just looked at, and kids who want to be remote get to be remote. That's the green. In middle school, the district has said, let's let families decide. And kids who don't want to come to school will set up a single remote middle school that cuts across more than 1 traditional school. And then for high schools, the focus is on 9th graders being in person, and then a remote option for everybody else. And you can imagine any number of permutations of this, but we're trying to make the trade-offs from across the system to ensure that we can support students as best we can, given physical distancing requirements, community preference, operational issues, and resource constraints. So that brings us to the overall process for developing these models. And it got complicated for us. We tried to boil it down to a process that others could follow. that we would follow if we were starting over again. And this is what it looks like. Step one is about establishing guiding principles. You need a touchstone that you and your community members can lean on in making your decisions. And many communities are past this point already, but if not, it's a good thing to be starting with. And then we go to the process of identifying, well, which students need to be in person, either because they have particular needs or they aren't able to access remote instruction, and which students are going to be fully remote, often because they choose to. Their families say, we're not ready to send our child to school. There's a whole set of operational data that you're going to need to gather as well. We focused so far on physical distancing and maximum class sizes, but there are also issues around transportation and entry and exit of the buildings that may further limit the number of kids and adults you can have in the school building at any time if you're planning for physical distancing. And armed with that information, you can plan for what is a combination of models you want to prioritize across the system, or if you're doing it within your school, across your school. And once you have a sense of what those models might be, you can actually design the schedules and staffing models. And again, our comeback models are designed to provide examples of what this could look like going forward. So before we go to our second discussion, I want to just refer to the fact that all of this is available on our website. It's erstrategies.org, which you can see here. And right on the homepage, there's a link for exploring our COVID-19 resources. And that will get you to everything that we have described here. Also, before we wrap, I want to name that this is just a really challenging time for everybody. The work you are doing as school leaders and school team members is so critical and uniquely challenging and difficult for this moment in time. And we are just very grateful for all that we see happening all over the country and all over the state of Tennessee to figure this out. As part of that process, we are learning too. And so at the bottom of that same page that you'll click through to on our website, there's a link to take a short survey if you're up for it. We welcome your feedback. What's working for you? What's not working for you? What do you want to know more about? That is incredibly helpful information for us. And of course, through the folks at the University of Tennessee and Dr. McIntyre, you can provide feedback and ideas and questions as well. So with all of that, let's send you off to your discussion. And here's the guiding question. What are some of the choices that you are considering right now for organizing your resources to best meet student needs when you return to school? And some of the factors that encourage you to consider in this conversation are what you're hearing from your community, their need and preferences, what kind of physical distancing requirements you might need to plan for, how you want to think about in-person versus remote school, where you feel like you have an option to do the best you can for kids with the challenges and the constraints that you face. Where can you be flexible? Where can you be creative? Where can you rethink the way we do school and think about it differently in any other local context that affects your community particularly? As a last note before you go into this conversation, I just want to name that as we talk to leaders in schools and systems all over the country, one thing that is clear is just how uncertain the times are, right? From a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis, the health situation, the economic situation, the educational situation changes, and it changes from community to community. And so the thing I would encourage you to do as you go through this process is to operate with the best information you have, recognize that it is going to be imperfect, and make some plans for what scenarios you might think are likely or potential to come forward. And that means that there's going to be some wasted work. You're going to plan for some things that won't happen. But I think the thing that is most concerning for us is, in what we see, is leaders who are paralyzed and aren't able to move forward. And the thing that we find most inspiring in the conversations we're having is to see folks really going down the path of thinking through what they can do to support kids in any number of scenarios, particularly ones that they think are likely given their local context. So with that, thank you again. Really grateful for your work, grateful to be part of the conversation, and very excited to hear after these sessions how your discussions have gone, and looking forward to tracking progress in the state.
Okay, so we're going to go to a small group conversation, and here is, we took David's question and added a couple others to it. So just as a reminder, here are the questions. They're actually in the chat as well, so you can access them there. And I'm going to open our small group discussion right now. please turn on your video and your microphone. We'll have a great conversation, and we'll have just under 10 minutes, I guess, to be able to do this and then come back and wrap things up before the top of the hour. So I'll invite you to small groups right now. Okay, y'all, welcome back from small group, and I am going to share my screen, and then I'm also going to put in the chat the survey link. So if you don't mind to take the survey for us today, we really do appreciate your time. It's about a minute or two, but it gives us really good feedback and the opportunity for us to be able to ensure this is a great learning experience for all of you. So just before, we got a few minutes. So anyone would like to share some of the conversation that you had in the small group, any insights, takeaways, thoughts, comments from the small group conversation that you would be willing to share with the larger group? And just turn on your video and turn on your microphone and jump in.
Dr. McIntyre, I'll go and share from our group. I like the comment that one of our principals made. This training has caused me to reflect. Of course, that's what we need to be doing all the time, but right now especially, we need to be reflecting. Another comment was that we need to move forward with grace. That in itself is huge. And then move forward intentionally, and that being the key. So we had great dialogue, great participation. Thank you to all principals out there.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Rouse. And yes, I think the notion of moving forward with grace is absolutely what we need to do in this moment, where there's lots of challenges and lots of moving pieces. But certainly also, I appreciate the comment about reflection. There's a lot of complexity, as we can see from the work that we've done today and the exploration we've done. There's a lot of options and opportunities and permutations and combinations of resources and how we might configure them. But I think the other comment you made is really important as well. Let's do that with intentionality and think about how we best serve our students and make those choices consciously and with our eyes open, and make those trade-offs with intentionality and purpose as well. I'm going to wrap this up in just a moment, but just wanted to see if there's any last thoughts or insights or takeaways. I know these are complex issues. I know that there is a lot to think about and a lot to work through. I guess for me, the big idea from the conversation with ERS is really about the fact that we can do anything we want. We just can't do everything we want. And so as we think about the needs of our kids, as we think about whether we're in person, remote, hybrid, and we think about managing all of the educational options and opportunities that we want to offer, it's really about prioritizing, making sure that we are able to provide a great education for our kids. And then what are the choices that we have to make, or the trade-offs that we have to make in order to make that happen? So for me, that's the big takeaway. It's, again, hugely challenging, but I think there's some good models here that can be valuable. So I'll leave just one more second for any last thoughts or takeaways before we wrap up.
Dr. McIntyre, I really appreciated my group, their emphasis on taking care of the students and taking care of their staff. They really stress the need for, the check-in times, whether they're high schools and checking in with their students as a group, or with our short people in elementary schools. And so they saw that as the baseline for really getting the learning started.
Outstanding, Nancy. A great reminder. All of this conversation about resources and how we manage time, people, and money is in service to making sure we provide a great education to our kids, to make sure that our kids and our staff are taken care of, and that we're able to really support them in their learning and in their work. So that's a great reminder. I want to wrap up, and I want to thank the Tennessee Department of Education. I want to thank Tennessee SCORE. I certainly want to thank Education Resource Strategies. I want to thank Dr. Ellen McIntyre, who is the Dean of the College of Education, Health, and Human Sciences at the University of Tennessee, who was able to join us for this session, and appreciate her support in our doing this work. And most of all, as we wrap up, I want to thank you, our principals who are doing just extraordinary work under really challenging circumstances here in the state of Tennessee. I really appreciated the conversation today, and I really appreciate your continual focus on doing what you need to do to take care of our students and make sure that they have excellent educational opportunities and equitable educational opportunities here in the volunteer state. So I thank you, I appreciate you, and I hope you'll join us next week. Our final module for the Principal Professional Learning Series is next week. It's on school culture, collaboration, and community, and I do hope you'll join us. So thank you so much, and y'all have a great day. Take care.